what we want to talk about today, which is being able to go into the second week of our current sermon series on Joseph. Before I introduce that series, I want to say thank you to everyone who faithfully gives here at Grace Fishers Church, because the truth is everything that we do here, being able to even be here this morning, I mean, that's all contingent on your faithfulness and the generosity that you show week in and week out. And so we just want to say thank you. And there's multiple ways you can give, as you can see there, but thank you. This is our second week of Joseph, and Joseph has always been an inspiring figure for me. We often look at figures in the Bible and call them even like Bible heroes or whatever, but a lot of individuals in Scripture, they really kind of teach us what not to do. And Joseph, though, he shows us such a faithful, solid way to honor the Lord in really some of the hardest circumstances out of anyone that we see in Scripture. And so being able to learn more about Joseph is super exciting, and I think we have a lot to learn from him. And so, Rob, go ahead and come up, and let's dive into this.
Thank you, Nathaniel, and the bearer of the table. Thanks, Don. I'm too old for moving that. Appreciate you, my friend. By the way, I live on a retention pond, and this year there's not much retention. There's just not been much rain. So it's this dreary day, just bring the water because it's more like a retention swamp. But whatever, we'll see. So last week we began this series, and I referenced a message by one of my favorite preachers, Reverend Evie Hill, from a message he preached in 1980. When he spoke about preaching at a church in Missouri. And at the end of one of the services, toward the end of the week, a young, angry, bitter woman confronted him. She was furious with him. She went off on him. I don't believe you. I don't believe a thing you said. None of that was relevant. And she went on to berate him over and over and over again, and the church, and throw all of it out. She was furious. I mean, she went, and he said she finally stopped long enough to take a breath. And she said, all right, preacher, if I'd have done what you said at the end, if I'd have given my life to Jesus, so what? In other words, preacher, what would I have if I have Jesus? And this series is really answering that question with one answer coming at it from four different angles. And so we want to state the main idea behind this series, the answer to that question this way. When I choose to follow Jesus, no matter what happens or how I feel, he will always be with me. It's what he promised, and he always keeps his promises no matter what. And then I brought Psalm 16:8 as kind of like a key verse because it encapsulates this. David writes, I know the Lord is always with me. I will not be shaken, for he is right beside me. And as Nathaniel said, we're focusing on the life of Joseph, who really experienced God's faithfulness through some pretty big highs and some pretty low lows. And at the end of last week's chapter in his story, we see that he's brutally attacked by his stepbrothers who absolutely hate him. They rip off the coat that his father gave him that was unique to him. They throw him into a pit, and they sell him to as a slave to a caravan of slave traders who come to the cistern, to the place where they were, that well, and they're going at least 300 to 500 miles southwest to Egypt. And off he goes. And the brothers are rid of him, but they have to go home and tell their dad that they made up a story that he was killed by a wild animal, and his father is overwhelmed with grief and is inconsolable. His heart is crushed. We read this in Genesis 37. Then Jacob tore his clothes and dressed himself in burlap. He mourned deeply for his son for a long time. His family all tried to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. I will go to my grave mourning for my son. He would say that, and then he would weep. I'm betting his sons, who lied all about that and created this scenario for him, really had no idea how deeply it would impact their father. That's what sin does to us. It promises us much with little to no consequences, only to find out that the pain is far greater than we ever anticipated, which is something that arises in Joseph's life this week as well. So while Joseph's dad is home, overwhelmed with sorrow for his son, who he thinks is dead, Joseph is in chains on the way to Egypt. The merchants who bought him are going to sell him there to the highest bidder. And it would take them at least 15 days to make that trek. So he had a long time in chains to think. And when they finally get to Egypt, they sell Joseph to a man named Potiphar, who's no slouch. He's the captain of the guard for Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Pretty big deal for a 17-year-old guy. By the way, shout out to any teenagers in the room. You're my peeps. He ends up, this 17-year-old boy, ends up in the home of a wealthy and powerful man who worked for the king of Egypt. The record of this time in Joseph's life, though, you know what? It doesn't give us what he was thinking on that road in that caravan, or what he was thinking those first 24 hours or so in Potiphar's house. But boy, I bet there's some things that I could imagine I would have been thinking. For example, I wonder if he thought, how could I be so blind? How could I not see how much my brothers hated me? And my poor father, he's going to be wrecked. He's going to be devastated, all because my stepbrothers betrayed him. Am I ever going to see my dad again? And if I ever get out of this, I'll get my revenge. I'll make those guys pay. Well, it's not hard to imagine that some of those things could have crossed his mind. And I don't think it's too much of a stretch to consider how bitter Joseph would have been when he finally got to Egypt. I don't think it's also hard for us, not much of a stretch, to think he'd also been furious. I mean, just out of his mind with rage. He want revenge. He would fight then against everything, and we would refuse to cooperate with this new life that's thrust on him that was none of his own doing. Nor would I be surprised if the trauma of being brutally attacked by his own family, thrown into that pit, and at the time thought he was going to lose his life, but then sold, I can't imagine that trauma wasn't a part of what could have been going on in his mind. But we see none of this with Joseph. On the contrary, we read this. The Lord was with Joseph, so he succeeded in everything he did as he served in the home of his Egyptian master. Joseph seems to have gotten down to business. He worked hard and he served well without pouting, without being hateful or disrespectful to all those who are now thrust in front of him and in his life. I think something happened on that long trip to Egypt. I think the faith of his father was becoming his own faith throughout that journey, which is exactly what we'll see in the future. It'll come out a whole lot more clear than in this moment, but I think that was the background for him. Joseph had a healthy frame of mind in spite of cruel actions of his brothers, so much so that whatever task Joseph was given with this right mindset, he did well. And his boss saw it all. Potiphar noticed this and realized the Lord was with Joseph, giving him success in everything he did. So this unbelieving Egyptian man sees how well this servant is doing, and it's benefiting his own family. At some level, Potiphar realizes it's due to a higher power, due to something divine, due to the Lord in whom Joseph believed. What Joseph believed and how he would have lived it out would have been vastly different from what his Egyptian boss believed. His boss would have believed in a whole number of gods and goddesses. And that boss would have believed that the king of Egypt was blessed by those gods and goddesses. Yet here before him, working hard and with integrity, is a young man who believes there is one God over all. Well, because of what Potiphar saw, he gives Joseph a huge promotion, and the result is awesome. This pleased Potiphar, so he soon made Joseph his personal attendant. He put him in charge of his entire household and everything he owned. From the day Joseph was put in charge of his master's household and property, the Lord began to bless Potiphar's household for Joseph's sake. All his household affairs ran smoothly. His crops and livestock flourished. So Potiphar gave Joseph complete administrative responsibility over everything he owned. With Joseph there, he didn't have to worry about a thing. Potiphar, the intelligent, powerful, right-hand man to the king of Egypt, puts a teenage foreigner in charge of his affairs. As a result, Potiphar's wealth grew and grew, and with his household cared for by a man he trusted, he can focus on the priorities that the king wants him to focus on. Blessed by the Lord through Joseph. Sounds like something the Lord told Joseph's father Jacob, grandfather Isaac, and great-grandfather Abraham. And all the families of the earth will be blessed through you and your descendants. And what's more, I'm with you. What's happening to Potiphar through Joseph is a taste of what's going to come. I would bet in a way none of those men would even imagine would be happening through one of their own line in that way. Joseph had heard all kinds of stories about God's faithfulness, but now he's experiencing them for himself. No matter what happened, no matter what he thought, no matter how he felt, God had been with Joseph, keeping his promise to do so. And Joseph is finding out again and again, God always keeps his promises, no matter what. Years later, one of Joseph's descendants would write this key verse himself because he would experience God's presence himself through all kinds of situations. David writes, I know the Lord is with me. I will not be shaken, for he is right beside me. So instead of fighting against the life he didn't want, that he was forced into due to the evil actions of others, he works hard and with integrity. He goes from being the favored son, being thrown into the pit by his brothers. And then he goes from being sold into slavery to a trusted and favored slave in the home of a powerful, influential, and wealthy man. Everything is going well. Life is great. So let's cue the sappy music and start the credits. Joseph is living large in Potiphar's house. Yeah, but not so fast, Glenda. Things are about to take a sharp turn. Joseph was a very handsome and well-built young man, and Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him lustfully. Come and sleep with me, she demanded. So just when things are going well, Joseph is tempted by the wife of his boss. He's good-looking, a well-built young man, in at least his late teens, maybe early 20s by now. We can be sure she was a beautiful woman, surely confident, let alone powerful, and in charge. Now, many in our world might say, go for it. You guys are two consenting adults. You could do whatever you want behind closed doors. It's none of our business. Might I suggest to you that is an incredibly shallow view of who you and I have been created to be. But this young man has godly character, and we read, but Joseph refused. Look, he told her, my master trusts me with everything in this entire household. No one here has more authority than I do. He's held back nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God. Joseph speaks to her rationally, with great wisdom and maturity. Your husband trusts me with everything. Why would I betray him? What you're asking me to do is wrong, evil, and downright wicked. And not only that, you're asking me to turn my back on God who's been faithful to me. Nothing he says matters to her. She is absolutely blinded by her fantasies and by her lust. She's obsessed. She's so fixated, she's clueless as to the impact that this will have on her own life, let alone his and others. But she won't be deterred. She kept putting pressure on Joseph day after day, but he refused to sleep with her. And he kept out of her way as much as possible. Can you imagine the pressure on Joseph? It's his boss's wife. She's got all the power. She's got all the control. And every time he turns around, she's trying to get him to sleep with her. Everywhere he turns, she's trying to get him to give in. Come on, lay with me. It'll be great. Nobody's going to know. I mean, trust me, you'll never regret it. He, a trusted servant, but she, the woman of the house, with all the power and the influence, and she won't take no for an answer. Joseph refuses every time and does all he can to stay away, but she can't let it go. It absolutely consumes her. One day, while Joseph's at work as usual, she comes upon him and grabs him by the coat and demands, "Now, come on, sleep with me." Joseph has to wriggle himself out of her grasp and takes off, leaving the coat in her hands. And there she is, alone in the room now, rejected again and feeling humiliated. Her cold heart can't take being rejected. And now her lust shifts into rage. Who is he to say no to me? Who does he think he is? Does he know who I am? That foreigner, he'll pay. Without hesitation, she jumps into action and screams for her servant, "Look, my husband has brought this Hebrew slave here to make fools of us. He came into my room to rape me, but I screamed. And when he heard me scream, he ran outside and got away, but he left the cloak behind me." Instead of her realizing what she had done was wrong and repenting of that, she immediately swings into action to cover her tracks and to ruin the life of a young man who would not give in to her advances. And when her husband gets home, she blurts out the same venomous story and puts him in a corner by pointing the finger at him. "It was that Hebrew slave you brought into our house. It's your fault. None of this would have happened if you didn't bring that foreigner in here. He's not one of us, and so what are you going to do about it?" Well, Potiphar was furious, which is exactly what she wanted. And in the blink of an eye, he throws Joseph in a special high-security prison reserved for those the king deemed disloyal, dangerous, or unworthy. No trial, no sentence, no escape, no end in sight. Despite working hard to maintain his integrity by being loyal to Potiphar and being faithful to God, he is wrongly accused and his life is shattered because of that one woman, because she held all the cards and there was nothing he could do. Interestingly enough, there's no mention of Potiphar taking time to hear Joseph's side. May have happened, we don't know. Nor is there any explanation why he didn't have Joseph killed, which he could have. Though I wonder if maybe he trusted Joseph and was shocked, or maybe his wife had a reputation. I don't know, we can conjecture all we want. Either way, here we are. Once again, Joseph's life is turned upside down because of somebody else's hateful actions. He didn't deserve any of this. From the favored, trusted servant to a prisoner in the king's prison. Now that's all that we have recorded about Potiphar or Potiphar's wife. Nothing else is said about them in the rest of this story. You wonder, does she repent or not? Certainly, based on what we have there, there's no indication that she did. And there's no record of it, which I think is not only incredibly sad, but I think it reflects a sad reality for you and I. Because sometimes on this side of eternity, the wrong is not made right in our lifetime, which is so incredibly hard and so painful, which is why we need Jesus. Well, there's a whole lot of things we could talk about from this chapter in Joseph's life, but I simply want to highlight two observations. The first is the way Joseph viewed temptation. From the outset, he sees it for what it is: wicked, immoral, selfish, and just plain wrong. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God. Joseph had his mind in the right place from the beginning. He could have had a bitter attitude toward God. He could have said to God, "This whole thing in my life now, it's your fault. You didn't protect me. Where were you? Why didn't you intervene with my brothers? Why should I ever trust you? I'm young, I'm single, and after all, I think I deserve this." Not at all. That's not what Joseph thinks. His frame of mind keeps this temptation in the right perspective, which protects him from making a foolish decision that probably would have cost him his life. Centuries later, his descendant, King David, obsesses over a woman he sees and finds attractive, and as the king puts everything together so that he can have a sexual relationship with this woman. He abuses his power and his authority, just like Potiphar's wife abuses her power and her authority. When this woman becomes pregnant, David tries to hide it by getting rid of her husband and eventually having her husband killed. And he keeps it quiet for a while, just between him, until God brings a man to confront him and lay it all bare before him. He can't keep it quiet anymore. And this man, David, who was king, writes Psalm 51 out of the despair of his heart and the cry of his heart before God. Have mercy on me, O God, because of your unfailing love, because of your great confession. Blot out the stain of my sins. Wash me from my guilt. Purify me from my sin. For I recognize my rebellion. Get this line here. It haunts me day and night. Against you and you alone have I sinned. I have done what is evil in your sight. When exposed, finally, David doesn't justify it or try to run. He finally calls it and names it for what it is, wrong and sinful. He's been living a lie. He has sinned before God and cries out to God for mercy and forgiveness, which he receives and experiences, as you see in the rest of the Psalm 51 and in other places. And it all started in his mind when he saw and began to nurture a fantasy. But Joseph was the one who called it what it was from the start. A number of years ago, I ran into a friend at a conference. We hadn't seen each other in years, so we got together, we had dinner, and he just blurted right out to me, I'd been unfaithful to my wife, he said. He said a woman called him with a very seductive phone call, and then when she showed up at his house later, he gave in. He gave in to the temptation. I never should have done it, he said. It was one time and it was wrong. I told my wife and some of the leaders in the church, I want you to know so that our relationship is open and honest, and this part of my past doesn't just stay in the dark. I'm forgiven and I'm grateful, but it was the wrong thing to do. That was years ago, and they're doing well today, which we all know isn't always the case. And theirs it was. But you know what else he told me? He said he knew it was wrong right away. When he hung up the phone, he thought, she's good looking. And the fantasy in his mind began. That's when I should have shut it down, he said. I should have told my wife and key people in our lives. Instead, I let the temptation grow in secret, which is why it was so easy to give in when the opportunity came. After over 40 years in pastoral ministry, I can tell you far too many stories about lives of those who have been impacted by temptation when they gave in. About how a romantic relationship derailed one's life with God, family, and friends. And over those 40 years and all of those stories, some people came back to God and others didn't and have not to this day. Some experienced forgiveness and restoration, like my friend, but not all. Some came clean and experienced God's mercy in ways they'd never experienced before. And others are still fighting against it to admit they ever did anything wrong. And one of the most common themes that I've heard over all these years, it has all started up here. A thought that was wrong, unwise, selfish, sinful. A fantasy gets nurtured, and arguments that rationalize the decisions they were going to make are soon formed along with that fantasy and all blurred out when the time comes. It's no wonder Jesus says to you and I that the greatest commandment of all is to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, and our mind. And Paul's words amplify this wisdom in this way. Don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think, you fantasize, you dream, you wonder. Fix your thoughts on what is true and honorable and right and pure and lovely and admirable. Think about things that are excellent and worthy of praise. Joseph could have stewed in his anger and allowed his mind to go in all kinds of harmful directions, but he saw the temptation for what it was, and he remained faithful in the face of relentless attempts to lure him away, but it cost him his job, the relationships he had nurtured in his new place, and landed him in prison. But in his mind, he knew what was true, and he knew what was honorable, and he knew what was right. Observation number one, Joseph had a right view of the temptation from the beginning. And the second observation is how Joseph experienced God's faithfulness, which is all over this chapter in his story, chapter 39. In verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph. So he succeeded in everything he did as he served in the home of his Egyptian master. And this one is my favorite in this chapter. The Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love. And then the Lord was with him in that prison and caused everything he did to succeed. Joseph's life was totally altered, absolutely out of his control, by the hateful actions of his brothers and now of this boss's wife. He didn't want to leave his family, and there's no way he wanted to end up in the king's prison. But time and time again, the Lord was at his side, just as he said he'd be, and he will be in the weeks to come. And each time, Joseph's faith grew deeper and deeper till it became clear he would follow God no matter what. Okay, Rob, that's fine. I get that. Appreciate that. But what do you do when you fall? What do you do when you give in to temptation? That's a great series for a day ahead, but I just want to offer two simple things. First, get it out of the dark. Don't go it alone. Tell somebody who's a wiser, older follower of Jesus or one of the pastors. Don't fall for the temptation that you could do it on your own and that you can fix it. You might not be able to fix it. One of the consequences of sin is we might not be able to control the outcome. But God will meet you and stay with you in here. Don't fall for the lie that I could do it by myself and I could just fix it by myself. So get it out of the dark and get your mind into the right place. Maybe read or reread Psalm 51. Choose a verse or passage of Scripture that just kind of sits with you and stews in your mind and your heart. Put it on the dashboard of your car, on the window in your bathroom, somewhere where you'll see that day after day. Maybe from Philippians 4, 6 to 9. Just something else to be able to put into your mind so your thinking becomes thinking on that which is good and wise and true and honorable. And remember this. God's grace is beyond what you could ever imagine, and now you need it. Don't we all? And trust his grace will meet you. Trust his grace will help you, and you will experience him in a way like never before. And be sure you're around older believers of Jesus who can look you in the eye and say, yeah, I went that way too. But let me tell you what God did for me. Bring it out of the dark and renew and reframe your mind. So I want to wrap today up with a poem that was actually written about 20 years ago. It's kind of fun, but it's also a sacred review of this time in Joseph's life, written by a very famous poet. Many of you may or may not know that the poet, it's our pastor of worship, Josh Weber, the famous poet. So this is his. In the land of Egypt, down Potiphar's way, the young man Joseph had come to stay. A servant of virtue, integrity, and heart, he served with all his mind from beginning to start. But one day in the house, with a deliberate, lustful stare, the temptress made her move, though Joseph was unaware. Don't be startled, she said. I just want to talk. But let's talk in my bedroom, since the door has a lock. Of course, Joseph was wise and saw through her evil plan. He had a feeling this talk might get out of hand. But she said, no one will know. It'll be our secret, I swear. My husband's not home. In fact, he probably won't care. But Joseph was no fool. The Lord was with him, in fact. So he politely refused and said, I cannot do that. But she pleaded and begged and persisted every day after day, everywhere and every way. He resisted and said, no, how could I commit such a sin? Then he left the crazy temptress, much to her chagrin. Through anger and tears, the temptress, though dismayed, was bound and determined she was going to get her way. So she plotted and planned to catch Joseph off guard by sending all the servants out to work in the yard. With no one around to foil her desperate plot, she moved in for the kill and said, Joseph, you're hot. Then she grabbed his cloak. I didn't write it, just saying. Then she grabbed his cloak and she pulled him in, and he fled from her presence to keep himself from sin. While running and running down the dusty road, Joseph suddenly realized that he was without his robe. When he finally returned home to the scene of the crime, there was Potiphar and his wife. No smiling faces this time. The temptress had lied, had accused Joseph of rape. Potiphar burned with anger and was in a troubled state. His decision was final. Joseph is imprisoned for good, no longer a servant in the house of this Lord. But to see the silver lining is to see the greater good, because through it all, God was working, even though Joseph had not understood. God is faithful and just. His promises are true. He promised to never leave us nor forsake me and you. Thank you, Josh Weber. Yeah. You wrote that 20 years ago. Were you 4? I'm just saying. The sad reality is this. You and I will face temptation the rest of our life on this side of eternity. I'd love to tell you as you get older, it's going to fade away. There's no more. Not true. We will need to resist temptation all of our days, and we need God's mercy and grace in the midst of all of it. But all these temptations, some more intense than others, will promise comfort and pleasure without admitting the cost. It's why we so desperately need each other's encouragement and why we so desperately need Jesus. When I choose to follow Jesus, no matter what happens, no matter how I feel, no matter what I think, he is always with me. It's what he promised, and he always keeps his promises, no matter what, even in the face of temptation. And when we claim that truth, we can say boldly the words of David, I know the Lord is always with me. I will not be shaken, for he is right beside me.